unknown beyond a small group of interested participants and observers. It's been variously described as a vital but largely invisible part of the Alliance infrastructure, or a semi-secret of the Alliance. Ostensibly, it's an exercise in what's called second track, or informal diplomacy, whereas track one diplomacy is officially sanctioned diplomacy between government officials. Second track, or informal diplomacy, is a privately initiated diplomatic effort which brings together elites, politicians, business leaders, prominent academics, journalists, into a gathering to discuss matters of mutual interest behind closed doors, such as foreign and defence policy, economic policy, social policy, etc. There are other examples of this type of informal diplomacy in Australia, but nothing quite as successful as the Australian-American Leadership Dialogue. It is widely lauded in elite circles. It's been described as arguably the most valuable private sector foreign policy initiative ever undertaken in Australia, and a central institution in the Australia-US relationship. Officially, the objective of the dialogue is to strengthen the Australian-American alliance by providing a forum where leaders from both countries can share information and ideas, build personal relationships, and facilitate mutual understanding. That's what you'll read if you visit the dialogue's rather nondescript website, or read articles published by the journalists who are selected to attend. However, as I'll detail in my following remarks, the dialogue functions more like a pro-American lobby group, socialising Australian elites into the alliance orthodoxy, which holds an ever closer relationship with the United States as central to Australia's national interest. So, in order to understand the logic behind the dialogue's agenda to preserve the alliance orthodoxy, we need to start with the concerns that sparked its establishment. The story begins somewhat apocryphally aboard a New Year's Day boat cruise in Sydney Harbour in 1992, which was held in honour of US President George H.W. Bush, who was visiting Australia, the first US presidential visit in over 25 years. It was a time of significant concern and speculation in Australia about the future of the Australia-US alliance and relationship. Prime Minister Paul Keating had been promising more relative independence with the United States, and elites and journalists were publicly expressing their fears that in the new post-Cold War era, the US may decide to withdraw from the Asia-Pacific, that the Australia-US alliance would be without direction in the absence of a Soviet communist threat, and that the personal feelings and commitments between leaders of both countries were fading, and that this could cause the Australia-US relationship to drift apart. Sharing these concerns about the future of the alliance was distinguished business leader Philip Scanlon, then managing director of Coca-Cola Amatil, and soon to become the founder and driving force behind the Australian-American Leadership Dialogue. Scanlon held a deep-seated fear that he would wake up one morning and find that the US has declared independence from Australia. His fears are probably our hopes. As it turned out, Scanlon happened to be aboard the New Year's Day boat cruise in Sydney and seated at the same table as the US President. Scanlon expressed his concerns about the forthcoming difficulties in preserving the alliance into the future, given the shared memories of sacrifice in World War II were passing, and there was a new generation of leaders arising who didn't have those formative memories and experiences. The President apparently listened with approval and was encouraged by Scanlon's idea of creating a new group of Australian and American leaders who would cultivate fresh ties and preserve the centrality of the relationship into the future. 2 nights later, Brent Scowcroft, the US President's National Security Advisor, told Scanlon, "We've spoken to people, we've checked you out, the President wants you to go ahead." Less than 18 months later, the inaugural Australian-American Leadership Dialogue had its first meeting in Washington in June 1993. The important point in reviewing this history is that the dialogue emerged in the context of widespread elite concerns about the future of the relationship in the post-Cold War era, and a belief that the next generation of leaders did not possess the same personal and emotional commitment to the alliance as had the previous generation. The hope was that the relationship could be preserved by reinstilling the historical narrative of alliance in the minds of the next generation of elites. That historical narrative, or orthodoxy, as I'm sure you're all familiar, conceives of the alliance as a special relationship rooted in shared values and common interests. Values forged in the joint sacrifices of World War II and every war fought together since, and common interests in the defence of US regional and global hegemony and the neoliberal economic order that sustains it. More recently, the dialogue has focused on recreating the policy of orthodoxies of the alliance to fit the new geopolitical realities of China's growing power. According to Professor Hugh White, the dialogue's ethos today is that American primacy can and should be sustained in the face of the Chinese challenge, and that Australia's best interests are in supporting them doing so. So there are three main ways the dialogue functions to preserve alliance orthodoxy. The first is by carefully framing discussion and debate within very narrow bounds. The second is by socialising elites, particularly what's called the successor generation, or the next generation of up-and-coming elites who are likely to assume positions of influence in the future. And thirdly, the dialogue acts as a kind of gatekeeper of the alliance, rewarding those who conform and sanctioning those who depart from the status quo. I'll discuss these three functions in turn. Scanlon has explicitly rejected allegations that the dialogue is a pro-American lobby group or a cheer squad for the US alliance. Unsurprisingly, these views are just plain dumb, he maintains. The Australian's foreign editor, Greg Sheridan, claims that discussions at the dialogue are frank, fearless, friendly, fierce and intense, with every assertion challengeable and contested. When I asked noted journalist Paul Kelly if the dialogue offered the opportunity for serious discussion and debate about the Australia-US relationship and the nature of US foreign policy, he responded, "That's certainly my view." Contrary to these claims, however, there is ample evidence to suggest that the dialogue is structured to carefully frame discussion and debate within narrow bounds. To begin with, as long-term dialogue participant and journalist Peter Harcher states, radicals or opponents or critics of the alliance probably don't get invited to join. I haven't noticed any turning up, Harcher recalls. Certainly no member of the Australian Greens has ever been invited to attend the dialogue. According to former dialogue board member Richard Woolcott, I think Scanlon and the rest of the board generally take the view that the Greens really are a bit too far outside what you might call the normal Australian attitude. But the fact of the matter is, the dialogue is not supposed to be a forum for serious critical discussion and debate. As a former Labor MP and dialogue participant told me, speaking anonymously, I would have been surprised if there was serious criticism of Australia. I would have been surprised if there was serious criticism of Australia or America at the dialogue. I don't think anyone said it's an independent and objective look at Australian or American politics. To view it as something where there should be an independent critique of American defence plans in Iraq or whatever misses the point. It is of like-minded people, sort of the US faction, if you like. It's to promote the positive views of the alliance, not for us to critique their worldview. Needless to say, the dangers of repudiating a questioning or critical agenda ought to be apparent. Indeed, some former participants of the dialogue felt that because it is much of a cheer squad for the alliance, there was not much opposition to the invasion of Iraq prior to 2003. Even some strong supporters of the alliance find that the parameters of debate there are quite limited. Former Foreign Minister Gareth Evans, for example, states that during his time at the dialogue, Scanlon had a suspicion of anyone other than those who fell over themselves to demonstrate passion and affection for the US. The measuring stick applied was not just are you a friend of the US, but are you a devotee? Consequently, continues Evans, the dialogue is very much a cheer squad and a love-in, not an environment in which it is comfortable for people to be critical, certainly on any fundamental issues. Former Vice President of the Liberal Party, Tom Harley, agrees, stating that everyone at the dialogue is terribly polite to one another. It's all a kind of group hug. There isn't a diversity of views, it's all about getting on, which means agreement. Given the notable absence of those who are constructively critical of US foreign policy at the dialogue, discussion between Australians and the US and the Americans are almost slavish, Harley adds. A number of former dialogue participants from academia, although supportive of the Australia-US alliance, also expressed concern about the lack of critical discussion and debate. Professor Paul Dibb, for example, argues that the central problem of the dialogue is that it does not tolerate even mild criticism. In my experience, Dibb recalls, if you make even the slightest of criticisms of the United States, you're not invited again. That's not just my experience. My colleague Hugh White, he would have the same view, as would former Secretaries of Defence and Chiefs of Defence Force who I know, who have been to those occasions and would agree you have to watch what you need to say. Indeed, when asked how the dialogue might respond to his opinion of late that US primacy might be bad for regional stability, Professor Hugh White says, I can answer very plainly. I don't think it would go down at all well, which probably explains why I haven't been invited for quite a long time. Most of these comments come from interviews that I conducted with participants and former participants. You're unlikely to read such critical comments in the mainstream media. Part of the reason is due, or I should add that when I scanned every news item ever published about the dialogue since its establishment in 1993, only a handful of the over 1,500 articles published criticised it in any way at all. Part of the reason is due to the fact that all the prominent journalists who attend the dialogue are also among its most enthusiastic supporters and participants. Peter Harcher, Paul Kelly, Greg Sheridan are among some of the prominent ones. Unsurprisingly. Of course, it is also very flattering for journalists to be mingling with high officials and people in positions of influence and power, and also to score exclusive interviews or comments from officials. They don't want to lose their access by writing something critical of the dialogue. Daniel Flitton from The Age I contacted Daniel Flitton for The Age, who was a participant of the dialogue, and who my feeling is probably had some critical comments to say, but he refused to speak to me on the qualification that the dialogue has a very strict non-disclosure policy. More broadly, there are pressures on journalists to conform to the mainstream consensus about Australia's relationship with the United States. As Hamish MacDonald from the Saturday paper told me, for journalists who work for a mainstream newspaper as he used to, if you don't conform, you can find yourself on the outside, not getting access to anyone for a long time. Questioning those current paradigms can be a very lonely experience. You might find yourself not in touch with people in the institutions of power, but with people on the fringes. Relatedly, there are many inducements for journalists who conform, study tours, fellowships, grants and so forth, which can quickly vanish for those who depart from the status quo. As MacDonald points out, there is a lot of money for people who produce work that reinforces what powerful people want to hear. As I mentioned earlier, apart from carefully framing discussion and debate, outside the orthodoxy that challenges the special relationship narrative, the dialogue also functions to socialise elites or inculcate orthodox attitudes about the alliance. It achieves this in ways not too dissimilar from how US political and foreign leader exchange programs work to tie foreign elites and allied countries to American hegemonic interests. The origins of this process go way back to the 1940s and 1950s and US military research into psychological warfare, which is an interesting story itself, but unfortunately one that I don't have time to go into at the moment. Apparently there is a resident expert here on US or cultural exchange programs somewhere, I can't find her now. So maybe she can educate us during the Q&A. But basically the way US exchange programs socialise foreign elites is by subtly laying in front of them a number of material and psychological inducements to remain committed to the status quo. The result is foreign leaders who are left with a taste of the benefits they can reap, assuming an attitude consistent with the interests of the United States, but also in accordance with their own personal career ambitions, beliefs and interests. And it is often highly effective. It doesn't work particularly well to convert people who are already hostile or critical of the United States, but rather those who are already predisposed to America. It's a kind of preemptive effort to ensure that foreign elites, particularly what's called the successor generation and those up-and-coming elites, remain committed to US interests when they eventually come to assume positions of influence and power in their own countries. In the case of the dialogue, founding member and former Liberal MP, David Kemp, believes that there is a conscious and targeted effort on the part of the dialogue to co-opt the anti-American elements in Australian politics, particularly in the left faction of the Labor Party. Scanlon, he argues, has captured in the dialogue the very strong pro-Americans and immersed in their company the people who've got a less intuitive liking of the United States. He's provided a forum through which the pro-Americans can digest the anti-Americans and show them that they're not so bad after all. It's been highly successful. Kemp's observations are, I think, almost certainly an exaggeration. As already noted, serious critics of the alliance are not invited to participate, so there's really not anyone to convert. However, for those participants who already have a predisposition to support the alliance, the dialogue does help to deepen feelings of attachment. The remarks by Liberal MP Kelly O'Dwyer are typical in this regard when she states that, through the discussions that we had there at the dialogue, my views have become even more solid on just how important that relationship is. Rather than converting critics, the dialogue appears to prod participants into taking further steps in a trajectory they were already on. It may be subtle, a former Labor MP explained to me, but the dialogue does nudge you a little bit in that pro-American direction if you're not already there. As I mentioned, the dialogue achieves this by providing essentially the same material and psychological inducements that have proven so successful in US foreign leader exchange programs. I don't have time to go through all of them now, so I'll just mention a couple of prominent ones. To begin with, the dialogue bestows a sense of self-importance on invitees simply for being selected to participate. Once the Australians get there, the Americans are also very good at what George Orwell used to call duchessing, or when British MPs were patted on the back by dukes and lost forevermore. In the case of the dialogue, the potential to be overcome by the sheer stature of the event has been duly noted. According to a former senior Australian diplomat who spoke on condition of anonymity, I think by being invited, Australians feel a bit privileged. Being let into the inner sanctum and hearing for a couple of days a group of highly articulate and intelligent Americans captures them. They do become very pro-American. The susceptibility to being captured is particularly acute for young and ambitious rising political leaders, where an invitation to a series of exclusive off-the-record, top-level discussions is likely to be viewed as a privileged opportunity. As a former Labor MP, who was relatively junior at the time of his first and only dialogue event, recalls, as a political figure, you like to be at the centre of the action, so to speak, even if that's a bit of an unconscious sort of thing. Because of the long period the dialogue's been around, that it's established, that it's well reputed amongst high officials, I think attendance at that and being part of that does add to your positive view of the alliance. Everyone who goes there, I noticed, felt like I'm at the Australia-US dialogue. It had a degree of cachet in attending. I think that adds a lot to what people feel about the alliance, and so on. In the ALP in particular, according to Mark Latham, receiving an invitation to attend the dialogue is considered to be a necessary ticket for rising through the party ranks. He says, when I first became a shadow minister in 1996, shortly thereafter, people like Gareth Evans, Kim Beazley and Arch Bevis and a few others were being whisked off to Washington for a big conference, and there were high expectations about it beforehand. Then you wondered, gee, what do I have to do to be invited to that level of seniority in the system? For those who do get lulled into it, there's that feeling of, oh, I've made it now. The dialogue is the peak body for this. Perhaps more than any other single factor contributing to the process of socialisation is the access provided to high-level officials and all that entails for career advancement, particularly for young and rising leaders. Recall that one of the primary reasons for establishing the dialogue was to target the next generation of leaders who were perhaps less emotionally attached to the alliance. It has been remarkably successful in this regard. Paul Howes, who was head of the Australian Workers' Union when I interviewed him, and no doubt a targeted future leader, states that when you look through the dialogue, when you look at the young participants, you see 5 future Prime Ministers sitting there, 10 future Foreign Affairs people. One often quoted example of a well-targeted leader is former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd. He is such a striking example that the others seem to pale by comparison, declares former Dialogue Board member Sam Lipsky. Paul Kelly agrees, stating that Rudd is a really conspicuous example of how the dialogue has had an influence over the next generation. Rudd was one of the initial invitees to the inaugural dialogue event in 1993, long before anybody had heard of him. As a young bureaucrat from Queensland, Rudd was unfamiliar with the US and, according to Kelly, became educated in American ways and built his US networks virtually entirely from the dialogue. As Rudd himself has acknowledged, the truth is, I'd never even visited the US before the first dialogue, so concentrated an Asianist had I become. Rudd used the extensive networking opportunities afforded at the dialogue to advance his political career. As Lipsky states, everyone knows that Rudd, from the moment he smelt power in Washington, assiduously cultivated every link and network created by the dialogue. He just couldn't get enough of it. It became quite important in his growing ambition to become Prime Minister. All those doors were opened for him by the dialogue. Rudd, of course, evolved into one of Labor's strongest supporters of the alliance and a committed participant at almost every dialogue event since its establishment. In his first speech to the dialogue as Prime Minister, Rudd reiterated his commitment to the alliance orthodoxy when he declared that US global and regional leadership is something which we in this country, Australia, are proud to support, and we intend to be your partners for the future. Rudd concluded his speech by declaring, I salute this dialogue. I salute each and every one of you who have been participants in it. For Rudd, and indeed his wife Therese, the dialogue was more than just an important informal network, but rather part of what he called our wider family. It was Rudd who appointed his longtime friend Scanlon to the position of Consul General in New York in 2008. The impact of the dialogue in shaping Rudd's thinking is impossible, of course, to precisely or accurately measure. Yet the fact that it had an impact is difficult to deny. As someone who held a positive predisposition to the US but did not have any personal links or had not even visited America, the dialogue opened doors to Rudd to forge closer connections with and make himself known to the American political elite. The primary factor behind the development of Rudd's strong relations with the US was his own ambition. The role of the dialogue was to help facilitate the realisation of that ambition. The socialisation mechanism was the path that was laid before him with no obligations but plenty of benefits as an inducement to remain committed to the status quo. So, the final way that the dialogue achieves its agenda to preserve alliance orthodoxy is by acting as a kind of litmus test for measuring the alliance loyalty of future political leaders in Australia. Entry into and performance at the dialogue are often used as a benchmark for gaining the equivalent of a stamp of approval or disapproval of one's ability to manage the US alliance when that ability is under question. The experience of former Labor leader Mark Latham and that of former Prime Minister Julia Gillard are two prominent illustrations. Latham, of course, was quickly identified as a danger to the alliance orthodoxy after his first major foreign policy speech as opposition leader, when he implied that the Australia-US relationship was an unequal partnership. In response to the flack Latham received from his departure for the status quo, Scanlon warned that the alliance needed hard work and constant nurturing, and that every Australian political leader needs to develop his or her own understanding of the depth and breadth of the alliance with the United States. Scanlon did proceed to warmly welcome Latham to the dialogue in 2004, which he proclaimed was about achieving mutual understanding between leaders, not merely consensus. However, while Latham initially accepted the invitation to attend the dialogue, he later retracted that decision for fear of being embarrassed politically on account of his views of the alliance. Then Foreign Minister Alexander Downer responded by stating that Latham's withdrawal from the dialogue illustrated he had cut and run from the US relationship, and that he should have gone and demonstrated his credentials to manage the relationship in a mature fashion. Similarly, on the American side, then Deputy Secretary of State Richard Armitage expressed regret that Latham had cancelled his planned trip to the dialogue in Washington, professing that it would have been an opportunity for him to get exposure to the length, the breadth, the depth of this relationship. When Rudd assumed the position of Labor leader in 2006, he was strongly urged to attend the dialogue by other members of his party to symbolically reaffirm Labor's rejection of Latham's attitude towards the alliance. Gillard too was carefully watched and assessed in elite circles for her performance at the dialogue in 2008, where she made her first foreign policy address as Deputy Prime Minister. Unlike Latham, Gillard did not fail to impress. Peter Harcher wrote that propositions such as Australia and the US working together to help build a world where civilization will persist, as Gillard phrased it, was music to American ears. Paul Kelly, who wrote immediately after the event, perhaps best articulates the specific role of the dialogue. He wrote, "Coming from the Labour left and once a loyal supporter of the anti-American Mark Latham, Gillard has been inducted into the political culture and rituals of the alliance. This is a prime function of the dialogue. She has become a true believer." In other words, according to Kelly, the dialogue had both assisted Gillard and judged her affirmatively on her transition to an Orthodox Alliance loyalist. Any questions over Gillard's commitment to the status quo arising from her affiliation with the left could be laid to rest now that the dialogue had unreservedly accepted her. Gillard's performance at the dialogue was also recalled after she became Prime Minister in 2010. The Sydney Morning Herald editorialised that Gillard's foreign policy agenda promised little change, as the, quote, former campus radical has made the transition to the safe mainstream consensus without a ripple. The editorial concluded by stating that Gillard, quote, had been a participant in the second-track diplomacy effort known as the Australia-American Leadership Dialogue and in the newer Australia-Israel Forum set up last year. In these two sensitive areas, where politicians are carefully watched for deviation by powerful lobbies, she has flagged her adherence to the norm. In a number of diplomatic cables leaked by WikiLeaks, it was revealed that the American embassy also saw Gillard's attendance and performance at the dialogue as evidence to assuage previous concerns about her ambivalent attitude towards the alliance. Indeed, the dialogue is perfectly suited to help current and future leaders refute those critics who might cast doubt upon their alliance loyalty. As one dialogue participant explained to me, continuous participation in the dialogue is a clear manifestation of your support for the prime role of America in Australian foreign policy concerns. It's like, well, that's fact. You can't say I'm anti-American. I participate in the Australian-American Leadership Dialogue. So you're able to position yourself, therefore, clearly and unmistakably in the middle of mainstream Australian foreign policy thinking. The risk that Gillard or even Latham posed to the alliance was probably never very serious. And nevertheless, their experiences illustrate the role that the dialogue does play as a gatekeeper of the status quo. Journalist Glenn Milne was correct when he told me a few years back that the dialogue has not faced a formidable challenge since its establishment. However, he warned, it will have to start muscling up and really prove its worth in the future if there were to arise any high-level questioning of the value of the relationship and the place of the United States in the Pacific. I think it's fair to say, with the election of Donald Trump, alliance gatekeepers like the dialogue are going to have their work cut out for them. I'm sure there are going to be lots of questions about Donald Trump and the implications for the Australia-American alliance. I'll probably just leave that to the Q&A. I should add, though, that the dialogue is not the only private gatekeeper of the alliance. It is part of a broader array of private initiatives that have arisen in recent years dedicated to protecting and strengthening Australia's relationship with the US. Paul Kelly identifies the United States Studies Centre at the University of Sydney, the Australian-American Leadership Dialogue, the Lowy Institute for International Policy, and the Australian Strategic Policy Institute as prime examples of a surge in private networks in recent decades that have helped to institutionalise Australia's relationship with America. Moreover, these private networks are really just one element of a much larger Washington lobby in Australia. All those elite groups, state, corporate, military, intelligence, academia, media, that promote the alignment of US and Australian foreign policy and a regional and global order that protects and enhances Western strategic and economic power, often at the expense of the public interest, including a just and peaceful regional and international order. It's a formidable force for those of us who would like to see an independent and peaceful Australian foreign policy to have to overcome. However, the very fact that alliance loyalists feel the need to establish institutions like the dialogue to constantly reaffirm the importance of the alliance demonstrates, I think, that they are not as confident as they proclaim about its strength. And that, I think, should provide us with a good deal of hope that it can be successfully challenged and overcome. And I think I'll leave it there.